So the third question has to do with classic colonialism, the Indian problem, which you discuss it in the Gaza situation, and resource control. This is the theme of the question. So you discuss the problem of resource control and policing of a people's resources for the well-being of the settler and as a blackmail for the native population and or adversarial government. In the case of Iran, I am from there, arguing how this eventually changes the earth into an impossible human space. In expanding on this, you write how this resource control cannot happen without portraying the inhabitant as inferior in terms of humanity, and it cannot happen without, second one, using the classical myth of the empty land in order to build a colonial imagination. This imagination from thereon will perceive any presence or existence of inhabitants as a burden or problem to be solved, not as a relationship to be had on equal footing. In discussion of colonialism in Palestine, the disturbing sameness of the patterns, almost for me, it like bothers the eyes. In 10 Myths, you write, nevertheless, when they first arrived, the early settlers were surprised to encounter the locals whom they regarded as invaders and strangers. In their view, the native Palestinians had usurped their homeland. They were told by their leaders that the locals were not natives, that they had no rights to the land. Instead, they were a problem that had to and could be resolved. And this notion of Indian problem exists somewhere else, in North America as well. Settler colonialists were refugees of a kind, seeking not just a home, but a homeland. The problem was that these new homelands were already inhabited by other people. In response, the settler communities argued that this new land was theirs by divine or moral right, even if in some cases other than Zionism, they did not claim to have lived there thousands of years ago. In many cases, the accepted method for overcoming such obstacles was the genocide of the indigenous locals. The disturbing sameness that I mentioned can be seen when I said in North America, can be seen in Alex Zukas's work, where he writes, a key European justification for conquering foreign land was the idea that these lands were uninhabited. Behind this justification was the application of the Roman legal concept of terra nullius. Western Europeans and their Euro-American cousins after 1500 adopted the idea of terra nullius, empty lands, to legitimize and popularize conquest and settlement of land in the Americas, Africa, and Australia. Empty land was often land previously unknown to Europeans, terra incognita, which I find it so interesting that if it's unknown, it should be empty. Europeans and later Euro-Americans mapped terra incognita and cited terra nullius as a rationale for conquest, even in cases where lands were clearly not uninhabited. Within a larger public discourse on imperial projects from the 16th through the 19th centuries, maps played a major ideological role in popularizing the deceptive notion of empty space as part of this larger imperial project. Now, your work reminds this sameness to the people who have been told that their settler colonialism is something other than settler colonialism, right? So oftentimes I've had very good Israeli friends who say, it's not the same. This is not the same. It's not settler colonialism, what's happening in Israel. What are your thoughts about the sameness, first of all? And what kind of responsibility does it put on our shoulders? And also, one of the things that I want to mention is it's very hard to hear for anyone whose imagination is, of these sublime ideas are made by classic colonial narratives that, oh, this is just a colonial narrative. I assume that it's quite disturbing to realize that one's imagination is complicit in other people's mass suffering. What are some of the reactions that you have received, and what do you think is to be done about these reactions when you remind the sameness of the imperial project to, your fellow compatriots?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because the challenge of even suggesting a context or a comparison, whereas people understand that when you suggest a context or comparison, talk about identical case studies, You don't take, you talk about similarities and dissimilarities, and the whole very conventional academic exploration here is just, urgent, and valid. And
Mhm.
yet, the very suggestion of examining whether the movement of Jewish refugees, if you want, or immigrants who were outcasts in Europe and used the British Empire to colonize part of the Arab world, to say that can we at least ask the question, should we teach it? Should we research it? Should we frame it as we do other movements of Europeans, many of them as well, refugees and outcasts, who colonized other parts of the world, to see whether this is the same phenomenon, and therefore we can learn more about the phenomenon in general, but also about the concrete case studies and
Yeah.
illuminate them better. Even now in 2025, in very established academic centers, the very suggestion of such an attempt
Yeah.
is questioned as legitimate. In 2015, my postgraduate students in the University of Exeter, where I teach, organized a conference, Settler Colonialism in Palestine,
Yeah.
with a question mark. And all hell broke out from the political elite, from the Jewish community. Very few of those who criticized the idea of having the conference knew what settler colonialism was, but they did understand that the word Palestine and colonialism
Yeah.
is something that the pro-Zionist lobby in Britain cannot allow to be heard,
Yeah.
to be voiced, even without understanding what this kind of conference would look like. What would be the outcome. So the challenge here is to insist, first of all, not on the results of the research, not about your own opinions about this contextualization, comparison, framing, but the right to do it.
Yeah.
And this is very strange. And if you ask Palestinians, I think that's one of the things that after 75 years, 76 years after the establishment of the State of Israel, that they still are in this position also from their side of the story. What do I mean by this? If they would like to look at their actions, their collective actions, their individual actions in the past, vis-a-vis Zionism, as anti-colonialism, the very suggestion is considered by important academics, not to mention establishment, media, and so on, as subversive, not to mention sometimes as support for terrorism, and definitely as anti-Semitism. This is something quite unique. I don't think there are many examples like this anywhere else, and that's what gives me, in a way, strength to deal with it, because I understand the uniqueness, not as we started our conversation. Palestine is not a unique case. What is unique is the Western attitude to Palestine, the global northern attitude to Palestine. And it has a lot to do with the complicity of the global north in what's happening in Palestine. Now, the global north was complicit in many crimes against humanity, against indigenous people. However, because of the passage of time and all other circumstances we're
Exactly.
not going to go into, it is willing to discuss it. Doesn't say it always admit it, but it's willing to have a sorry day here, asking forgiveness from a certain tribe in an American campus there. That's possible.
Yeah.
For Palestine, this is something, the complicity is dual. There's a dual complicity in the act itself, but in the denial as well. And I think this denialism is the explanation why what you are facing, and this I'm saying to anyone who wants to go into that field, you will face the very questioning of your right to deal with this issue. Are you qualified? Sometimes you have the impression from that's what my personal experience was, that the reaction was that unless you're a Zionist, you have no right to deal with this question. Namely, a good historian of Zionism can only be a Zionist. Non-Zionists are, automatically are bad historians. How can they understand it? And and um, and this is something that educated professors around the world still accept, and so on. And that's quite surprising. But that's a fact of life we have to deal with. And to me, it's connected directly with legitimizing the Palestinian struggle as an anti-colonialist struggle, which is far more important to my mind than legitimizing the framing of Zionism as a settler colonial
I see.
project.
Oh, that's very interesting. I also have to say that one of the reasons why I don't do land acknowledgements as the chair for decolonial studies, SIG, it's very for this very problematic issue that if we can speak about it, it's likely because there is nothing that can be done about it at this point. So the power dynamics are already made. It's just kind of a performative act when we say, "Oh, we're standing on the territory of," especially this nation that Baltimore is standing on. And I'm going to read the names of the tribes whose history is a history of resilience as well. However, if I'm mentioning it and if I have the right to mention it, it's because it's not a live colonialism. It is because it's a decolonial thought, and as I said, it brings accolades. Versus when you talk about, you're absolutely right. When you talk about a live colonialism, in the case of Palestine, you mentioned that it's unique. It has a unique attitude. If you had Western colonialism as a conference in Exeter in your university is like, British colonialism, no one would have objected, but because it's a live colonialism and, actually words can maybe disrupt some imaginations, then that's troubling. So thank you for that.